Dawn came without color, only a thin line of silver marked the horizon. The sea was calm, unnaturally calm, as if it knew what waited beyond it. Engines murmured deep within the hull, a low heartbeat of steel. Salt spray hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of fuel. Above, gulls circled once, then vanished into mist. It was April 7th, 1945. The last great battleship of Japan, Yamato, was heading south. Escorted by 9 destroyers, her decks glistened with dew and oil. From the bridge, officers stared into fog that hid the world. Below, men stood at stations they had known since youth: gunners, stokers, signalmen. They moved with a quiet precision, born of resignation, not hope. Somewhere in the bow, a young sailor adjusted a charm around his wrist. A small wooden tag. His sister's handwriting burned into the grain. He whispered a line of prayer, unheard beneath the turbines. It was not for victory, only that his death might mean something to someone. The loudspeaker crackled. "All hands, prepare for battle readiness." No urgency in the voice, just the sound of duty performed once too often. Men checked ammunition belts, wiped fog from optics. Steam hissed through pipes. The ship exhaled like a living creature. From above, sunlight began to break through thin layers of mist. It turned the sea into molten glass. Far ahead lay Okinawa, 500 miles, unreachable. Every sailor knew the truth, but no one spoke it. There was no return route planned, no air cover assigned, no resupply waiting, only the command: proceed until destroyed. A breeze shifted. With it came a faint vibration in the air, distant, irregular. To a trained ear, it was unmistakable. Aircraft engines far beyond sight. One officer lifted binoculars, saw nothing but haze. Yet his breath tightened. The sky had begun to hum. Silence settled again, heavy and unreal. Crewmen paused in their motions, waiting for an order that did not come. In that pause, the scale of it all began to dawn. The largest warship ever built, moving toward its own extinction. Not a weapon anymore, a monument adrift. Records describe the Yamato as 263 meters long, displacing 72,000 tons when fully loaded. Her main guns could hurl a shell the weight of a small car over 20 miles. Yet those guns, designed for duels against other giants, faced an empty sea. There was no enemy battleship left to meet her, only the sky. Wind swept across the deck, cold and sharp. Crewmen raised their faces into it, blinking through salt. They had polished every railing the night before, tradition perhaps, or faith. The brass gleamed faintly in the gray light. Somewhere below, a record player spun the national anthem through thin speakers, warping with the ship's motion. In the radio room, an operator tapped gently at his console. No reply. American forces had jammed the frequencies. He tried again, slower, like speaking to a ghost. Still silence. He looked up at the clock. 0640 hours, and removed his cap. Outside, the fog began to lift. The water darkened from silver to steel blue. On the horizon, white crests marked the swell. Nothing else moved. Only Yamato, her bow splitting the surface with regal slowness. Somewhere below decks, steam curled from the galley pots. A cook ladled miso broth into dented bowls. The scent drifted through corridors lined with condensation and rust. Men ate in silence, heads bowed, not in prayer, only reflection. An officer passed, his boots echoing down the passage. The men rose, saluted, then returned to their meals. He hesitated, watching them a moment, then continued on. His reflection followed in the polished bulkhead, a younger face than his years. Above, a lookout reported faint glints high in the sky. At first, they seemed like sunlight on water, then the pattern moved, deliberate, circling, tiny crosses of light weaving above the clouds. The first U.S. reconnaissance planes. The admiral stood on the bridge, binoculars steady. No expression crossed his face. He gave no order to turn, only to maintain course. For the men below, the world narrowed to the rhythm of the engines. Every thrum in the steel floorboards felt like the heartbeat of destiny itself. They could feel the ocean deepen beneath them, cold, infinite, waiting. And yet, there was no fear, only clarity. Each man understood what had begun. The final voyage of the Yamato was not an operation. It was a requiem, composed in metal, smoke, and silence. The lookout's voice broke again over the intercom. Aircraft sighted, bearing 185, altitude increasing. The hum of the turbines deepened. A thin whistle carried across the wind, rising, fading, rising again. Then, quiet. Somewhere below decks, a single wrench fell to the floor. The sound echoed longer than it should have. In that small silence, the truth settled across the ship like mist. They would never see Okinawa. They would never see Japan again. The first discovery had already come, and no one needed to speak it. The sea knew, the ship knew, and still she sailed on. The sound of engines faded into a softer, rhythmic thrum. Distant waves struck the hull in measured intervals, each like the tolling of a bell. Sunlight pierced the remaining mist, revealing her shape in full. Yamato. Her silhouette towered above the waterline, vast, deliberate, unreal. To the sailors who served her, she was not a ship. She was a nation, made visible in steel. Every plate of armor, every rivet, carried the weight of empire and memory. She had been built in secrecy, deep within the Kure shipyards. Even the workers who forged her armor were forbidden to speak her name. The first hammer struck her keel in 1937, when Japan still believed the world could be won by steel alone. At that time, aircraft were fragile things. Wooden wings, unreliable engines. Admirals believed the battleship would always rule the sea, so they dreamed of one so powerful that no enemy could challenge it. Yamato was their answer. Her 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, could fire a shell 1.5 tons heavy. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, her range vast enough to strike a city from beyond sight. When she launched in December 1941, she symbolized invincibility, but even then, that idea was already dying. By the time she was complete, the ocean itself had changed. Warplanes replaced warships. Eyes in the sky replaced scouts on the sea. The new empire was measured in altitude, not displacement. And yet, Japan could not let go of her. To hide the Yamato would have been to admit defeat, not to the enemy, but to time. So, she remained visible, anchored like a monument to a vanishing faith. Archival photos show workers polishing her decks before inspection. Children from naval schools lined the pier to wave flags. A woman in kimono bowed deeply as the ship's whistle blew, the sound echoing off the harbor cliffs. For a generation taught that steel and spirit were one, this ship was proof that Japan still mattered. Below deck, though, her crew knew the truth. She drank 15 tons of fuel every hour. Each trip drained a fleet supply. In the final months of war, even filling her tanks became impossible. Coal and oil mixed to stretch the last reserves, black smoke trailing as if she burned her own future. A machinist once carved a small inscription near the engine room hatch. It read, "Pride is heavier than armor." No one reported it. No one erased it. When American B-29s began leveling Tokyo, the old admirals met in dim-lit rooms. The battleship fleet they once commanded was reduced to ghosts, sunk at Truk, Saipan, Leyte. The carrier Taiho had gone down. Musashi, Yamato's sister, was lost in the Sibuyan Sea. Still, they refused to surrender the idea of the invincible ship. And so they gave her one last mission, Operation Tengo, to sail toward Okinawa with barely enough fuel to reach it, to strike the invasion fleet and beach herself in fire, to die as a fortress, not as a wreck. Her captain, Kosaku Ariga, accepted without question. He was 51. He knew it was hopeless, but he also knew that turning away meant something worse, the death of honor itself. The night before departure, survivors later said, The ship felt almost alive. Hammers rang through the corridors. Men painted hull numbers, cleaned brass, checked radios. Not because it would matter, but because that was what sailors did. One technician found a worker's glove wedged between two armor plates. Oil-soaked, hardened by time. He left it there, a relic of the hands that built her, and of the belief she carried. At 400 hours on April 6th, the admiral gave the order. Engines roared to life. Dock hands stepped back as the ship eased into open water, the harbor walls trembling with her passage. Cherry blossoms, shaken loose by wind, drifted down across the decks, pink petals landing on black steel. From shore, a group of apprentices saluted. Their voices joined in a farewell song, old and slow, carried by the morning wind. The notes reached the sailors as faint vibrations against their helmets, then faded into the noise of turbines. By dawn, Yamato was gone, a moving shadow on the inland sea. No banners, no broadcasts, just the echo of engines receding into fog. Records say she consumed 6,000 tons of fuel for the voyage, enough to power an entire division's transport for a week. And yet, she carried no air escort, no refueling plan, no expectation of return. In that paradox lay her truth. She was too proud to hide, and too obsolete to survive. As the sea widened around her, clouds gathered again, low and heavy. The horizon dimmed, swallowing the ship in haze. A single ray of sunlight lingered on her bow gun, then vanished. From above, reconnaissance photos would later show only a faint wake, a straight line cutting through gray water, ending in distance. A metaphor, historians would say, for the empire itself, powerful, beautiful, doomed. Below decks, the engines drummed on. Men worked, ate, prayed. The air smelled of oil and sweat. Someone whispered, almost to himself, "We were born too late for battleships, too early for peace." His voice was lost in the roar of the turbines, but it lingered, a human echo inside the machinery of pride. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. The storm was coming, and the sky would soon take everything. Rain fell over Kure Naval Base like ash from a burned-out world. It coated the cranes, the empty docks, the rusting hulls of ships that would never sail again. Inside the command building, lamps flickered under blackout curtains. A dozen officers stood in silence around a single map. The order came at 1600 hours, April 5th, 1945. It was brief, only a few lines of ink on rice paper. The handwriting was firm, almost ceremonial. Yamato and escorts to proceed southward. Objective, Okinawa. Engage enemy fleet. Do not return. No signature was needed. Everyone in that room understood what it meant. Japan had no carrier force left, no air cover, no reserves of fuel or hope. The army clung to the ruins of Okinawa, while the navy, once proud and vast, was reduced to a single gesture. Operation 10 Go. 10 meaning heaven. Go meaning operation. But heaven had already turned its face away. The admiral who read the order, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, stood motionless for nearly a minute. He had once commanded entire fleets. Now he commanded a funeral procession. He placed the order on the table, adjusted his gloves, and said only, "Very well, prepare the ship." Outside, thunder rolled through the harbor. Each echo blended with the hammering of rain on metal. Men worked through the night, loading shells, inspecting engines, sealing watertight doors. They were told it was a sortie, not a sacrifice. But the silence among them said otherwise. In the lower decks, word spread quietly. The older sailors guessed the truth first. There were no air cover coordinates posted, no return supplies loaded, and only half the usual medical stores. A radio operator overheard one officer murmur, "It's not a mission, it's a message." He didn't ask what kind. At midnight, the rain stopped. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of diesel and metal. Spotlights moved like ghosts across the hull as the final crew boarded. 1,467 men, most under the age of 25, many barely trained, all volunteers, or told they were. Captain Arrigo walked the deck in silence. He paused near the starboard guns, watching the water ripple against the pier. A thin film of oil floated there, reflecting the lights like a broken mirror. He touched the steel railing, warm from the engine heat below, and whispered something too soft for others to hear. Later in his quarters, he took a small envelope from his pocket. It held a photograph, his wife and daughter standing in a garden before the war. He turned it over, read the note she had written years before. "Wherever the sea takes you, remember, the moon shines on both of us." He replaced it in his jacket, then pinned his sword to the bulkhead beside the bunk. The blade gleamed briefly in the lamplight, then dimmed as the ship's power shifted. At 0400 hours, sirens wailed across the harbor. Engines roared to life. Black smoke rose from the funnels, merging with the low clouds. Men on deck stood at attention as the admiral stepped onto the bridge. A single bugle call pierced the dawn. It was the same tune played when the fleet had sailed for Pearl Harbor 4 years before, but this time the sound had no triumph, only echo. Civilians gathered along the pier, mostly shipyard workers and their families. They waved handkerchiefs, shouted prayers, threw flowers that scattered on the current. A few young girls ran along the shoreline until they could no longer keep up. Their voices faded behind the engine's roar. From the hills, factory whistles sounded a long, low note, farewell to a nation's pride. And then she moved. Yamato, largest warship ever built, sliding from her moorings into open water. Her wake shimmered briefly under the gray light, then dissolved into the sea. In the control room, a petty officer marked the time in the logbook. Departed Kure, 0600 hours. Destination, Okinawa. He paused before writing the next line, then, quietly, added in parentheses, return, uncertain. Hours later, the fleet formed its final column, 9 destroyers, 1 light cruiser, and the Yamato at the center. From above, it would have looked like a spear thrown at the horizon. From below, it felt like a pilgrimage into darkness. One sailor, barely 20, wrote a single line in his notebook. "We are going to die beautifully." He folded the page and placed it inside his boot, the only place dry enough to keep it. At 0900 hours, rain began again, a steady drizzle tapping against the deck guns. The sea turned black, the horizon lost in haze. From the radar room came faint reports, distant pings, unidentified signals. The operators listened closely, then looked at one another. It was already too late. American patrol planes had them on scope before they left the coastline. The admiral gave no reaction. He simply turned to his officers and said, "Maintain formation." A silence followed, not from fear, but from understanding. They were no longer navigating geography. They were navigating fate. Above the bridge, the Imperial flag whipped in the wind, edges frayed from years of use. Its red circle bled into the gray sky. And for the men who looked up at it, that color meant everything and nothing at once. The sea hissed against the bow. A storm front loomed ahead, heavy and low. Thunder rolled, distant and hollow, like the sound of drums underwater. It was then, between lightning flashes, that the realization took hold. The order they followed had not come from strategy. It had come from despair. And despair, when wrapped in honor, could look very much like courage. Yamato pressed on, steady, magnificent, doomed. Each rotation of her propellers carried her deeper into the myth her builders had written for her. Men at their posts felt the vibration through the soles of their boots, a rhythm that would outlast breath, sound, or command. Somewhere below, a single light flickered in the radio room. The operator adjusted the dial, searching for a frequency that would never answer. Static filled the headphones, soft, endless, like rain. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the noise became the sea itself, vast, indifferent, eternal. The morning opened gray and soundless. Rain clouds hung low, pressing the horizon flat. For a moment, the sea and the sky seemed carved from the same dull metal. Then the engines began again, deep, patient, unbroken. From the bridge, Yamato's bow cut a perfect line across the swell. Her escorting destroyers followed at intervals, their wakes overlapping like threads in cloth. The fleet moved southward at 22 knots, a procession of ghosts. Each ship left a line of black exhaust that slowly dissolved into rain. Wind carried the faint tang of oil and smoke. Deckhands moved along the rails, tightening cables, checking the 25mm guns. They spoke in low voices, as though afraid to disturb the sea. Somewhere near the bow, a crewman hummed the rhythm of a folk song from Kyushu. It drifted upward, fragile as mist, then vanished beneath the roar of turbines. Above them, clouds split briefly, enough to show a streak of pale sunlight. In that instant, the brass on the rangefinders gleamed gold. Then the light closed, and the world returned to gray. Below decks, the air grew hot and thick. Boilers pulsed, pipes rattled. Sweat rolled down faces and vanished into the hiss of steam. Men worked in silence, the vibration of the engines beating through their bones. Every few minutes, a petty officer passed carrying a clipboard already soaked through. At 1100 hours, the radar room received its first echo, a faint blip at long range, high altitude, slow approach, an American scout. The operator reported quietly, voice steady, "Unknown aircraft, bearing 195, distance 120 miles." The admiral nodded once, no alarm, no change of course. They all knew what that contact meant. Once found, they would never be lost again. Minutes later, the hum of propellers reached human hearing, faint, distant, like insects over water. A lookout raised binoculars and caught a glint. Sunlight on wings, high above the clouds. Tiny dots circling, disappearing, returning. Eyes of the sky. The first confirmation that death was already watching. Still, the fleet maintained course. Formation perfect. The sea around them darkened with rain. Lightning flashed somewhere to the east. Silent, unreachable. In the radio room, operators listened to coded chatter from U.S. reconnaissance. Static, then bursts of clarity. Large surface contact, probable Yamato group, notify Task Force 58. The men looked at one another, but said nothing. The words were already prophecy. By noon, the weather shifted again. The rain stopped. The air grew still, heavy, almost electric. Waves smoothed into long, rolling swells that reflected the sky like glass. For a brief hour, the sea seemed at peace. On deck, men gathered to eat rice from tin bowls. Some laughed quietly, trading cigarettes saved from home. Others sat alone near the railing, staring at the endless horizon. One sailor unfolded a small piece of paper, carefully protected in wax cloth. A child's drawing, a house, a tree, a smiling figure in uniform. He studied it for a long time, then refolded it and returned it to his pocket. No one spoke to him. At 12:32 hours, a shadow crossed the water. A high-flying aircraft, U.S. PBM Mariner patrol bomber, sweeping wide circles around the formation. Anti-air gunners tracked it but did not fire. The admiral forbade it. No need to waste ammunition. Their position was already known. Minutes later, the ship's intercom crackled. "All hands to battle stations, condition 1. The tone was calm, almost routine. Men moved with practiced motion. Helmets, life vests, ammunition belts. The ship shifted mood instantly from routine to readiness. In the distance, the destroyer Yahagi signaled with light. Enemy air contact confirmed. Bearing 150. Multiple formations. The horizon flickered with movement, specks against the low clouds. Then the low drone of engines multiplied, deepened, merged into a single vibration felt through the decks. To the men on board, the sound came first as curiosity, then realization. This was not reconnaissance. It was a storm. Wind picked up, scattering the sea spray in glittering arcs. Sunlight struck the waves, flashing in broken rhythms. Light, shadow, light again. Every reflection looked like a wing. The gunnery officers barked coordinates, their voices echoing through metal corridors. The great turrets turned slowly, hydraulic gears grinding. Each barrel rose toward the sky, dripping rainwater like sweat. The crew braced at their stations. For a moment, everything held still. Then came the first whistle through the clouds. It was not yet an attack, only a scout's test. A single bomb dropped too high to strike. It splashed harmlessly off the starboard bow, sending up a white plume. Men flinched, then laughed nervously. But that laughter ended as quickly as it began, because the sky was no longer empty. Dozens of black dots now filled the northern edge of vision, tightening formation, descending. The sound became thunder, rolling toward them. Engines, hundreds of them, layered one over another until the air itself seemed to shudder. And yet, even then, no one panicked. Every man knew his station. Every man waited for the order. Captain Arriga raised his binoculars, tracking the first wave. He lowered them slowly. "All batteries," he said. "Open fire." Sirens blared. Deck guns erupted in flame. The noise was absolute. Metal, smoke, sky, and sea, merging into one violent harmony. From far above, an American pilot radioed, "Target in sight! Commencing attack run!" The wind shifted again, carrying the echo of his voice across the water. A strange calm followed, just long enough for one heartbeat of silence. Then the first bombs began to fall, and the men of the Yamato lifted their eyes to the sky, each seeing something different: duty, pride, inevitability, or peace. The battle for the last battleship had begun. The sound came first, a distant roar that grew into a wall of air. Engines layered upon engines, hundreds of them, their vibration turning the sea to trembling glass. The horizon, once gray and empty, now writhed with movement. Tiny black specks widened into wings, sunlight flashing off their bellies. The sky itself seemed to move. At 12:40 hours, radar confirmed the inevitable. More than 300 U.S. aircraft inbound from Task Force 58. Avengers, Helldivers, Corsairs. Names the sailors did not know, only shapes. To them, it was simply thunder descending. "Enemy planes approaching, all directions." The warning rolled through every corridor. Men strapped helmets, pulled belts tight, took positions at the guns. The ship came alive with noise, the shriek of hydraulics, the crack of anti-air batteries, the barked rhythm of orders echoing through steel. Below, fire doors sealed, watertight hatches clanged shut. The interior of Yamato became a furnace of motion. Then, daylight split. The first dive bombers fell out of the clouds in steep arcs, sunlight burning behind them. Anti-aircraft tracers streaked upward, glowing red through the haze. Explosions blossomed across the sky, black, orange, white. The air filled with metal and smoke. Men at the guns screamed above the roar, voices swallowed by the thunder. On the bridge, Admiral Ito stood motionless. He watched the attack unfold as if from a great distance. The first bomb struck aft, near turret number 3. A column of fire and debris burst upward, tearing men from the deck. The shock wave rolled through the ship, rattling the glass in every compartment. Steel plates groaned. Then came another impact, closer. The deck tilted slightly, recovered, tilted again. Beneath the bridge, damage control teams ran through smoke-thick corridors. Oil lines burst, spraying flame. Water poured through ruptured seams, flooding lower compartments. A petty officer shouted coordinates into a dead intercom. Another man tore open a bulkhead panel, searching for survivors. Above them, gunners tracked new shapes, torpedo planes skimming the surface. The ocean erupted around them in white geysers. Spray drenched the deck, steam rising as salt water hit molten metal. The air reeked of fuel, cordite, and burning paint. "Starboard battery, fire!" The 127mm guns responded in deafening rhythm, one after another, recoil shaking the deck plates. Tracer lines arced through the sky, connecting ship to cloud. For an instant, one plane caught fire, spinning into the sea. A cheer rose, brief, desperate, human. Then the next wave arrived. The sky darkened with aircraft, waves upon waves, descending from the sun. Bombs whistled down like rain. Each detonation blurred into the next. Deck planks shattered, antennas snapped, men vanished in white flashes. The air itself became a storm. Below decks, a cook crouched beside a bulkhead, shielding something taped to the wall, a child's drawing. Mountain, a river, a blue sky. The edges burned as smoke thickened. He covered it with his hand, though the heat seared his palm. He did not move. Back on the bridge, the admiral's aide reported fires spreading in Section B. The captain's voice cut through static. "Floodport compartments, counter the list." The ship heaved, groaned, then steadied. For a moment, it felt like resistance. Then a new shock hit, a torpedo on the port side, forward. The hull shuddered violently. Lights flickered, dimmed, then returned as emergency power engaged. In the engine room, men worked waist-deep in rising water. Steam hissed from ruptured valves. Someone coughed, a dry, rasping sound drowned by the roar of machinery. They kept turning the wheels, adjusting pressure, refusing to leave their posts. One shouted, "Hold her steady!" though no one could hear. On deck, anti-air gunners reloaded until their arms bled. Shell casings rolled underfoot like coins. The heat from constant firing scorched paint and skin alike. Still they fired, at shapes, at shadows, at memory itself. Through breaks in the smoke, fragments of sky appeared, impossibly blue, indifferent. In those moments between blasts, the silence was unbearable. You could hear the sea hissing against hot metal, the faint whistle of wind through torn rigging. Then another wave came, and silence was erased again. Data from American records would later show the scale: 227 dive bombers, 173 torpedo planes, and 100 fighters attacked across 3 hours. They dropped over 2,800 bombs and torpedoes. From the surface of the East China Sea, there was no sky left, only fire. At 1,335 hours, a bomb struck near the forward magazines. Flames shot 30 meters high, engulfing the flag mast. Crewmen fought to douse it, passing buckets hand to hand, though hoses had burst. They worked until the deck itself began to melt. Still, the ship did not sink. Her armor held, though scarred and bleeding. Every impact felt personal, a blow against belief itself. And the men, blackened with soot, kept fighting. They shouted not for victory, but for one another. A survivor would later recall a single moment amid the chaos, a lull between attacks when he looked out over the water. Smoke curled along the horizon, lit from below by flame. Through that smoke, he saw cherry petals drifting from a torn flag, petals of ash, not blossom, and he thought, so this is how the spring ends. Then the next torpedo struck, and he was thrown into darkness. Above him, the Yamato burned, proud, massive, defiant still. Her guns kept firing even as her crew fell beside them. For a brief, blinding instant, the ship seemed to stand against the sky itself, a mountain of steel in the middle of the sea. Then came the second wave, and the horizon disappeared in smoke. The sea itself had turned red, not from sunset, but from reflection. Fire on water, smoke in every direction. The Yamato moved no longer with purpose, only instinct. A wounded animal, thrashing against the inevitable. Every few seconds, the sky split open again. Bombs fell without rhythm, only gravity. At 13:45 hours, 3 torpedoes struck the port side in rapid sequence. The deck lurched. Men stumbled, fell, slid across oil-slicked steel. Water surged through the lower compartments like a living thing. The ship began to list. Only 5 degrees, then 7, then 10. Not much, yet enough to tilt every horizon inside her. In the engine rooms, boilers hissed through rising steam, valves screamed. Men worked in darkness lit only by emergency lamps. The heat was suffocating. One chief engineer, his uniform half burned, shouted for a wrench and got a prayer instead. It was enough. They fought the water with pumps already half submerged. Up above, the deck was chaos made human. Smoke choked the gun stations. Wounded men dragged ammunition crates with bloodied hands. One young sailor, his uniform blackened, eyes red, kept shouting coordinates even as the gun beside him melted from heat. When it jammed, he kicked the lever free, burned his foot, and did not notice. The sound of explosions never stopped, only changed texture. At first, they were thunder, then came the hollow thuds of internal ruptures. Finally, the soft, almost tender sound of things collapsing within, bulkheads folding like paper. Above it all, the great main battery still turned. Turret number 1 fired one last salvo, a gesture more than a strike. Shells hurled toward the clouds where planes no longer were. Each recoil shook the deck, sending cascades of flame and debris into the sea. Men cheered, because it meant they were still alive enough to make noise. Smoke obscured the world. The horizon vanished completely. Flames rose so high they created their own wind, pulling air through corridors, feeding on oxygen meant for lungs. Below decks, that wind became a roar. Loose papers, rags, photographs, all lifted, spun, burned, gone. A petty officer stumbled into a corridor filled with black water. Floating there was a small wooden box, charred but sealed. He recognized it, the box of good luck charms kept near the crew's quarters. Inside were folded scraps of home, hair ribbons, family photos, prayer slips. He lifted it onto a shelf above the floodline, just once, as if to save something sacred. Then the lights went out. Above, Captain Ariga gripped the railing of the bridge. His white gloves were gray with soot. He looked aft, saw only smoke and the faint silhouette of Yahagi, his escorting cruiser, burning stern to bow. The sea between them boiled with fuel fires. He raised his hand to his forehead in salute. No one could see, but the gesture mattered. At 14:02 hours, the next wave came. Low-flying Avengers carrying torpedoes. They struck again, and again along the port side. Each impact drove the list deeper. By 14:10, Yamato leaned 15 degrees, then 18. The ship began to slow, her great propellers biting unevenly at the sea. In the radio room, transmissions came in broken fragments. Engine rooms, flooding fast. Fire, midship. It can't hold. Static swallowed the rest. The admiral remained silent. He turned once to his officers, eyes hollow, unreadable, then looked back at the burning horizon. Outside, the deck tilted again, spilling spent shell casings into the sea. They floated briefly, then sank one by one. American pilots circled overhead, astonished. One later wrote, "The largest ship I ever saw refused to die." They kept coming, smaller groups now, finishing what the first wave began. Each pass tore another piece from her, yet still she floated, still she fired. Inside the lower compartments, sailors opened hatches by feel. Some carried wounded comrades toward the stairwells, climbing through smoke so thick it felt like water. Others simply sat where they were, faces streaked with oil, mouths moving soundlessly. A few wrote names on the walls with chalk, their final record. Then, through the din, a new sound emerged, deep, resonant, different from the rest. Not explosion, implosion. The forward magazines, overheated beyond safety, began to detonate inward. Flames shot through the ventilation shafts like breath. The entire ship exhaled fire. From miles away, American observers saw the plume rise higher than the clouds. The sea around the Yamato turned white from the concussion. Destroyers nearby were rocked sideways, their decks littered with debris that once belonged to the battleship's hull. For those still aboard, the world had narrowed to two sensations: heat and weight. The deck tilted past 20 degrees. Men slid toward the railing, clawing for anything to hold. The water below hissed as molten steel touched it. Then came the whistle, high, sharp, endless, the signal for abandoned ship. Few obeyed. There was nowhere to go. Captain Arriga stayed on the bridge. He refused to leave the ship he had sworn to command to the end. Witnesses on nearby destroyers later said they saw him standing there, sword at his side, coat torn by flame, as the ship rolled. No one saw him again. At 14:23 hours, Yamato reached her breaking point. The list passed 45 degrees. Men clung to gun barrels, railings, and ropes slick with fuel. The sea rushed upward, swallowing flame and steel alike. A low groan filled the air, the sound of a titan collapsing into itself. For a brief, surreal instant, the sky cleared. Sunlight broke through the smoke, striking the hull at an angle that made it shine, golden, almost beautiful. Then the forward magazines detonated. A blinding flash consumed everything. The shockwave rolled outward for miles, lifting spray hundreds of feet high. The sea turned white, then black, and where the Yamato had been, there was only flame, oil, and drifting silence. Of the 3,056 men aboard, only 269 would live to tell what's after. The rest became part of the sea that had birthed their nation. When the smoke cleared, the horizon was empty again. Waves smoothed, the wind returned. Debris floated quietly, helmets, timbers, fragments of flag, and among them, a single glove drifted on its back, palm open toward the sky. For a long time, no sound remained. Then, faintly, the hum of distant engines. American planes turning home. The war in the Pacific had just witnessed the death of its last giant. The age of battleships was over. The world had changed, and the ocean, as always, was first to know. For a few heartbeats, there was only light, a silent, impossible brightness that erased sky and sea alike. Then came the sound, not one explosion, but a single note of violence stretched across miles. The shock wave rippled outward, flattening waves, bending air. Destroyers nearby trembled, their decks shuddering as the wind of fire reached them. Where Yamato had stood, there was now only a column of smoke, a black pillar rising 6,000 feet into the air. It widened as it climbed, turning from red to gray to white, until it became a cloud that cast shadow on the water below. Men on the escort ship stared in silence. One later said, it was as if the sun had touched the sea. Then the pieces began to fall. Fragments of armor, shards of deck, planks still burning. Oil rained down like black snow. The sea hissed as flame met salt water. The air smelled of metal, fuel, and something faintly sweet. Scorched paint, cooked grain from the galley, the last meal unfinished. Beneath that smoke, hundreds of men still struggled. Thrown clear by the blast, they surfaced among waves coated in oil. Some clung to timbers, some to one another. The sea around them burned in patches, rings of fire drifting outward like petals. Each wave carried both heat and cold, the cruel balance of survival. A young gunner named Nakajima surfaced near what was once turret number 2. The water stung his eyes. He coughed black liquid, looked around, and saw the sky on fire. Somewhere behind him, a man shouted for help, then disappeared as the next explosion rolled through the wreck. Nakajima swam toward open water. His hand brushed something solid, a life buoy still bearing the ship's name in white paint. He clung to it, weeping without sound. A destroyer, Fuyuzuki, edged closer to the inferno, ignoring orders to stay clear. Her crew threw ropes into the water, pulling survivors from the flames. Each face that rose from the sea looked the same, black with soot, eyes wide, silent. Some were too burned to speak. Others whispered thanks before collapsing on the deck. At 14:30 hours, the great smoke column still climbed higher. Underneath, waves rolled outward in concentric rings, carrying debris across miles. Bits of paper, log entries, letters, prayer slips, drifted in the air before falling, waterlogging, sinking. A single page from the captain's notebook washed against Fuyuzuki's hull. The ink was half erased, but one line remained clear: hold her steady. Far below, the rest of Yamato descended. The ship's final roll turned her completely upside down. Air trapped within the hull burst free, boiling to the surface. Her great guns, each weighing more than a train, broke from their mounts and spiraled down through darkness. Within 6 minutes, she was gone, swallowed whole by the East China Sea. For the men still afloat, silence replaced the storm. The air grew strangely cool. Oil spread in long iridescent ribbons, reflecting the sky now pale and calm. Seabirds circled warily but did not land. Only the sound of waves remained, soft, rhythmic, eternal. Nakajima drifted for hours. At some points, he saw the flag, a torn scrap of red cloth floating nearby. He reached for it, but it slipped beneath the surface. He watched the color fade until it was only shadow below the waves. When Fuyuzuki finally hauled him aboard, he looked back once more. The horizon was empty. No smoke now, no sound, just the faint shimmer of heat where steel had met sky. He thought of the word Yamato, great peace, and how strange it sounded in that moment. American pilots circled at altitude, cameras rolling. They reported the target destroyed. From that height, it looked like a single dark wound upon the sea. Radio transmissions crackled with efficiency. Primary objective complete, returning to base. But several of those pilots later wrote that they could not celebrate. One said, "We saw no victory in it, only ending." As evening came, the water smoothed again. Oil fires dimmed to orange embers, then to smoke, then to nothing. The sun broke through the haze, turning the surface gold. For the first time that day, the wind was still. What remained sank quietly beneath. Armor, relics, names, and with them, an idea. That steel could stand against sky. That honor could outweigh inevitability. The sea closed over it all without ceremony. A single ripple spread outward, then vanished. By nightfall, no trace of the Yamato remained above water. Only silence, vast, clean, indifferent. The same silence that had filled the world before men thought to command it. And in that silence, somewhere far below, the ship that had carried a nation's pride lay broken yet whole, her guns pointing downward, her flag folded by current, her name carved forever into the dark. The sea had claimed its own. By dusk, the smoke had begun to thin. The horizon reappeared, a gray line of calm dividing the Black Sea from a sky streaked in copper and ash. Far above, American aircraft circled in slow, deliberate turns, engines droning low as if reluctant to leave. From their altitude, they saw no ship, only a spreading stain on the water, oil and fire drifting in long, uneven arcs. In the lead plane, Lieutenant Commander Robert Jenkins adjusted his goggles. Below, through gaps in the cloud, he saw what looked like the wreckage of a mountain slowly sinking. He did not cheer. No one did. The radio crackled across channels. Target confirmed destroyed. Return to base. Voices responded, clipped, professional. Yet, between the words, there was an unease no radio could hide. As they turned north, one pilot glanced back at the column of smoke still rising behind them. It stretched high enough to cast a faint shadow even at 30,000 feet. He would later write in his logbook, "It was not victory I saw. It was an ending too large to feel human." On the surface, the destroyers of Task Force 58 remained in formation, scanning for survivors. Searchlights swept across the waves, cutting paths of light through the drifting oil. Now and then, a hand broke the surface, or a face, and sailors leaned over the rails to pull another man aboard. No uniforms mattered anymore. Soot and salt had made everyone the same color. On the decks of Fuyuzuki and Hatsushimo, medics worked without sound. Stretcher after stretcher lined the passageways. Some of the rescued stared upward, eyes unfocused. Others simply closed their eyes and whispered names. A few sang fragments of songs, low, tuneless, half-remembered. One man kept repeating a single phrase. "The sea is kind. The sea is kind." It was not clear if he believed it. When darkness came, the sea grew still again. The fires faded to dull orange patches that pulsed like heartbeat. Then even those went out. Only phosphorescent plankton glowed in the wake of the ships, pale green lights swirling like souls that refused to sink. From the bridge of the American carrier Bunker Hill, officers watched the smoke dissipate on the southern horizon. A young ensign asked the admiral if the target had been the Yamato. The older man nodded once. "That was her," he said quietly, then added, "She was magnificent." No one replied. Records show that 386 aircraft had participated in the attack. More than 2,800 bombs and torpedoes had been dropped. In all, it had taken less than 2 hours to erase what once represented the pride of an empire. One torpedo, one well-placed bomb. That was all it took to end decades of faith in steel. The radio logs noted success, the mission completed. But no celebration followed. The pilots landed in silence, engines cooling in the night air. A few removed their flight gloves and stared at their hand, trembling slightly, though they would not say why, on the bar. Japanese side, the official report never came. No message returned to command. Only silence. A silence so complete it felt deliberate, like a vow. At Kure, when the last transmissions faded, the radio operators stood at attention and bowed toward the speaker. Then they turned it off. That night, the wind carried faint traces of oil smell even to the shore. Families who lived near the docks said they could feel it, a weight in the air, though they did not yet know why. Somewhere near the pier, a mother looked out at the water and whispered, "Come home soon." But the sea gave no answer. In the following days, the Americans combed the area for intelligence. They found fragments, twisted steel, a section of hull, a lifeboat overturned. Inside, floating face down, was a single officer's cap with a gold chrysanthemum badge still intact. A sailor retrieved it, rinsed it in seawater, then placed it gently on the deck. For a moment, no one spoke. The captain finally said, "Leave it," and they did. The next wave washed it back to sea. One pilot, writing home that week, described the scene in a letter now kept in the naval archives. "We hit her again and again, until she vanished. But when I saw the smoke rise, I felt no joy. It was like watching a mountain die." For those who fought that day, understanding came slowly. They had not just sunk a ship, they had ended an era, and with it, a belief that wars could be won by courage alone. By the time the last aircraft left the area, the sun had fallen. The East China Sea lay still, black and endless. Somewhere far below, the Yamato settled into her grave, bow downward, stern high, her great guns silent. Tiny bubbles rose from the ruptured hull, carrying fragments of air that had once echoed with orders, songs, and prayers. Those bubbles reached the surface, broke soundlessly, and vanished. The sea, indifferent as ever, returned to its rhythm, wave after wave, erasing each trace. Only memory remained, carried by men who could never quite forget the sound of that final explosion. In years to come, some of those pilots would revisit Japan as allies. They would stand at memorials beside former enemies, listening to the wind move through stone. One of them, old and gray, would whisper to a Japanese veteran beside him, "We both lost something that day, didn't we?" And the other man would nod, not in agreement, but in understanding. Night deepened, the water darkened to ink. Stars appeared overhead, cold and countless, their reflections rippling where the Yamato had once burned. Each light seemed a soul returned to the sky. And for the first time since morning, the sea was quiet. No smoke, no flame, no sound. Only the slow exhale of waves, as if the ocean itself were breathing again. The storm had passed, but its echo would remain in the water, forever. 20 years later, divers found her, or what remained. 270 meters beneath the surface of the East China Sea, half buried in silt, half preserved by silence. A mountain of steel turned on her side, her guns still reaching toward nothing. Light moved across the wreck in slow, wavering ribbons. Schools of fish traced her outlines like memory rediscovering form. Where once men had shouted and burned, there was now only current, steady, patient, indifferent. Even the sea seemed to move more quietly there. Japanese survey teams descended first in 1985, their cameras trembling against the deep pressure. They found the bow broken, the midsection scattered, the superstructure peeled away by the force of her final explosion. And yet, amid the wreckage, certain things endured. The engraved chrysanthemum of the Imperial crest, a pair of binoculars fused into the bridge railing, a ladder that still led nowhere. One diver paused beside the forward turret, his flashlight glancing off the barrel's rim. He placed his hand against the cold metal, a gesture of recognition across 4 decades. The camera caught it, a single handprint glowing faintly in the dark, the touch of the living upon the dead. Above, on the research vessel, the sea was calm that day, glassy, still, gray as memory. When the first images came onto the monitor, no one spoke. Even the technicians who had never known the war lowered their voices. Someone whispered, "She's sleeping." Survivors of Yamato rarely spoke in public. Those who did used few words. They met each April on the shore at Tokuyama, placing white flowers in the surf, bowing as the tide pulled them away. They never saluted. They only listened, to wind, to gulls, to silence. One survivor, the gunner Nakajima, was interviewed late in life. He said, "We thought we were giving our lives for Japan. Later I realized we gave them to the sea." He paused, then added, "And perhaps the sea was kinder." Another told of seeing the captain moments before the ship rolled, standing straight, hat in hand, as the bridge windows burst inward with flame. He never forgot that image. It was not pride, he said. It was peace, as if he had already joined the ocean. In post-war Japan, the name Yamato lingered like incense. It appeared in poems, in songs, in the soft language of grief. For some, it became a symbol of sacrifice. For others, a reminder of arrogance and waste. Historians argued which meaning was truer. The survivors did not argue at all. They knew both could be true at once. Museums displayed models, tiny replicas under glass, the polished brass guns reflecting fluorescent light. Children pressed their hands to the cases. Their grandparents looked away. At memorials, the story was told simply. She sailed, she fell, she sleeps beneath the sea. No mention of orders or despair or the futility of it all, just the quiet dignity of those who went. American veterans, when invited years later, stood beside Japanese sailors at the same ceremonies. They bowed together, no flags raised, no anthems played, only the sound of surf against the stones. A U.S. pilot, one of those who had bombed the ship, wrote in a letter he never sent. "When I saw the wreck photographs, I felt something close to forgiveness, but not for them, for us." In 2005, a modern sonar scan revealed her entire form. The computer image showed the hull's outline, massive even in ruin, lying as if asleep beneath folds of sand. Engineers mapped her with precision, each gun turret, each seam, but could not measure what lingered above her, the weight of memory, the shape of loss that no machine can record. That night, as the ship's data scrolled across the screen, the team leader stood alone on deck. The sea was calm, moonlight cutting a path across the waves. He thought of the thousands who had died there, and of how easily the world forgets when the noise of history fades. He whispered into the wind, though no one was near enough to hear, "We're still listening." The words disappeared into the water. Perhaps the sea heard, perhaps it didn't. Somewhere below, the current moved through empty corridors. A door creaked open, closed again. A helmet shifted in the sand, and for a moment, just a moment, the silence felt almost human. The Yamato still lies there, half ship, half memory, its hull covered in coral that glows faintly when touched by light. Every diver who descends says the same thing upon return, that the ocean around her feels heavier, slower, as if holding breath. And when they rise again towards sunlight, they say they can still feel her beneath them, not as wreckage, but as presence, the echo of a nation's pride, and the calm acceptance of the sea that claimed it. Above the water, waves still roll toward shore. Children play where the ship first departed, their laughter scattering gulls into the bright sky. The wind carries no memory of what was lost, only salt and sound and the rhythm of tide. Yet for those who remember, the silence of the sea remains a language, one that says without words, nothing built by man truly disappears. It only changes depth. Morning over the inland sea, soft mist, pale light. The same waters where Yamato once departed now lie quiet, smooth as glass, moving only with the breath of wind. On the shore at Tokuyama, a memorial bell hangs beneath a cedar arch. Each April, at precisely 14:23 hours, it rings once, a single tone that drifts across the bay, long enough to reach the fishermen, long enough to fade into the same horizon she once crossed. Old men stand there every year, survivors, sons, shipyard workers. Some lean on canes, some on each other. Their uniforms no longer fit, their metals dulled to copper. They bring flowers wrapped in paper and pour sake into the tide. The bottles float a few feet, tip, and vanish. No words are spoken, only the sound of the bell and the gulls answering as if they still remember. For them, the Yamato is not a symbol of pride anymore. She is a reminder of how strength can outgrow wisdom, of how devotion can become destiny, and how the sea forgives in ways the world cannot. A boy once asked one of the veterans, "Why do you still come here? The war is over." The old man smiled, his eyes on the horizon that held nothing and everything at once. He said, "Because we are still listening." Then he turned back to the water, and the boy, without knowing why, grew quiet too. The tide carried the petals of their offerings outward. White, pink, red, colors of spring. Each petal floated until it disappeared into distance, the same path the Yamato had taken. No wreck, no grave marker, only direction. In America, at naval museums and veterans' halls, the Yamato's story is told with maps and models. Visitors lean close to glass cases, reading placards that speak of displacement, armor, range. Few linger on the final line. Sunk April 7th, 1945, East China Sea. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the halls are nearly empty, an old sailor will stop and stand before the photograph of that black plume rising into the sky. He'll stare for a long time, then whisper something under his breath, not words of victory, but of respect. History moves on. New ships sail, new wars come and go. Yet beneath all of it, the ocean keeps its quiet ledger. Names written in salt, eras buried in sand. What survives are the things we cannot see, the courage to keep going when hope is gone, the grace to understand that every ending is shared. Somewhere tonight, above those waters, the wind shifts exactly as it did 80 years ago. It carries the scent of diesel, the hum of turbines long stilled, the faint, imagined echo of a whistle blown at dawn. And if one listens closely, perhaps you can still hear them, the voices of men calling to one another through the smoke, not in fear, but in duty. The sea has reclaimed what was built to defy it. Steel has returned to salt, names to silence. But memory remains, woven into every wave that touches the Japanese shore. It speaks not of glory, but of the weight of peace, because peace, too, is heavy. It is carried by those who remember what it costs. The bell at Tokuyama rings again, once for the ship, once for the men, once for all who learned from their passing. The sound drifts outward, soft, measured, final, and as it fades, the horizon brightens, a thin line of light where sea meets sky. For those who came home, freedom was not a word. It was a promise paid in silence.